from the websites, and I'm reading them in alphabetical order. If that's okay. So, okay. So, thank you folks for coming and see our panelists. My name is Gordon Thompson, and I'm a professor at the City College of New York. My area is African American and American Cultural Studies. I've written on Harlem Renaissance, on canonical writers, Douglass, Richard Wright, uh, um, a little bit of Ellison, of course, Baldwin, and also Booker T. Washington as well, just looking back at the tradition that Robert Steptoe sort of spearheaded, basically looking at the autobiographical correlations with their long text. Um, and I'll pretty much leave it there unless I want to hear anything more. Here's myself. So in alphabetical order, we have Delang English from Macalester College. Um, and the topic of your talk is another country, another time. Okay. James Baldwin, social science fiction. So Delang K. English.
Dale Ann.
Sorry, tell me.
Dale Ann.
Dale Ann.
Yes, Dale and Ann put together.
Okay, Dale Ann. Gotcha. So it's Dale.
Dale.
Not Day.
That's correct.
Dale.
There's a break between the L and the A.
Okay, Dale Ann.
Yes.
English is professor of English.
Yes.
And English department chair. Currently, 2014, 2017, and earlier.
Yes.
I know, yeah. At the Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. St. Paul, Minnesota. Minnesota, okay. She earned her MA and PhD from the University of Virginia, and her BA from Oberlin College. She has held visiting appointments at Brown and Brandeis universities and was an assistant professor at Bowie State University, one of the oldest historical black colleges in the United States. So, she's the author of two books. One is Each Hour Redeemed, Time and Justice in African American Literature, University of Minnesota Press. And the other is Unnatural Selections, Eugenics in American Modernism and the Harlem Renaissance, from the University of North Carolina Press. So let's see, she'd like me to skip a little, and she's done a great deal here. So she has published essays on African American literature and culture so she's published essays on African American literature in a variety of different journals. She's a recipient of fellowships and grants from NHH and Mellon, has worked with MLA, and she has been giving invited lectures at Yale University, among other institutions. She's also a reviewer for a number of presses and journals, and she's currently at work on a digital humanities project titled A Genealogy of Afrofuturism. How is that?
That's the key, that last
one. Okay, A Genealogy of Afrofuturism. Okay, forthcoming. No, it's actually on the slide.
No. It's not ready yet.
It's not ready yet. Okay. Ready? Okay, thank you, Professor English. And then alphabetically, Merriweather. So next person is Victoria Merriweather. Okay, so Victoria Merriweather is at Clark Atlanta University. The title of your paper is Seeking Asylum in Giovanni's Room. Victoria Merriweather currently resides in Washington, D.C., where she works as a high school educator. She was introduced to Baldwin in high school, but her studies continued at Clark Atlanta University. There, she earned her BA and MA in English. and completed both her senior and master's thesis on the infamous author. Presently, she is pursuing her doctoral degree in educational administration and policy at Howard University. During her 10 plus years of teaching, Victoria has not only taught Baldwin, but she has also taken her students to visit the childhood neighborhood in Harlem, New York. Connecting students to the world's illustrated in text they read is so important to her that she's taken students to places as far as Japan and Zambia to experience firsthand the physical settings and cultures depicted in the various texts. Her hope is to one day bring her students to see Baldwin's Paris. In addition to teaching, she is continually on the quest to become a better steward of the environment and has worked with various NGOs around the world to support efforts towards sustainable development. In her spare time, she gardens, paints, writes, sings, and is an avid traveler. Good to know. Okay, and then our last on in this list is Sonja Schillings. Sonja Schillings. And 1 second. Get there. Okay, so I'm not going to get any of this right. Probably should just have you do it, but Justus Liebig, Universität and Gief. No, it's hard. Say it all for us, please.
Justus Liebig Universität in Gießen,
In
Germany.
Okay, I know no German at all. Thank you. Title of her paper is The American Traveler to Europe, Difference and Human Dignity in James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room. Sonja Schillings is a postdoctoral researcher and assistant to the Graduate Studies Executive at the International Graduate Center for the Study of Culture at her university. Until 2014, she was a doctoral candidate at the Graduate School of North American Studies in Berlin. Her dissertation on the, quote, enemy of all humankind, unquote, and the narrative construction of legitimate violence in Anglo-American culture is forthcoming from Dartmouth College Press. Between the completion of her dissertation and her current position, she has acted as a substitute junior professor for North American literature at the John F. Kennedy Institute for North American Studies. She has published articles on piracy, race, and space as intertwined concepts and 20th century American literature. So welcome, glad that you're here. I'm going to go first as it's indicated here, although I think that normally sometimes the chair goes last, just sort of to watch out for me. So what I would ask is if someone could keep time. I'm hoping I've got this down to exactly what it should be. So let me know.
How much time do you want?
I think this was like 20 minutes. Is that right? That's what you were told? 20 minutes. About 20
I'm
minutes.
sitting right at the
17.
clock, so
Okay.
I'll give you a hand at 5. How's that?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. I hope, in fact, that it goes there. I've been cutting it to make sure that it does not cut too much. So it's 15 minutes. It's always going to be 15 minutes. So I have various names for this paper. I think that the one I'll settle on today will be called Love's Geographies in Another Country. Okay, so I'm just going to get reading. So I'm sure Tommy says 5 too. In Another Country, Baldwin presents realistic spaces such as balconies, living rooms, beaches, and rooftops as privileged sites where characters escape the heteronormativity on display elsewhere in New York. Whether these alternative spaces are utopic at heart is an area of inquiry interconnected with the question of whether to define the characters that make their way to these privileged sites as exiles. This exilic and utopic dyad plays out around the theme of love. In the most tragic and darkest chapter, the first, the Black musician Rufus and his white girlfriend Leona find an alternative, accepting space to indulge their desires. Yet it is not the space itself that marks them as exiles, as it is the fact that they are interracial lovers at a time when such was still highly discouraged, to say the least. What makes the balcony at a friend's apartment utopic is less its cramped and public features than the proximity, I suggest, of the Hudson River, a body of water that serves as a leitmotif in the novel as witness to seemingly deviant or taboo forms of love. This talk then reevaluates separately then together the exilic utopic theme, not as much as a problem in modern life than as a literary concern that reconfirms another country's validation philosophically of post-categorical social practices. In fact, I suggest that through the text's inference of mythical motifs, these sexual practices are not entirely post-categorical, but deeply rooted in Western culture. First, there is a need to challenge the use of the term exile. In a search mainly of love, principal figures in another country flee the streets of New York, prompting some scholars to label them sexual exiles. Such characters make a prominent and early appearance, of course, in the guise of the gay personalities depicted in Giovanni's Room, for instance, particularly Eric, whose sexual departure is amplified by his flight to France, not unlike the other Eric and his lover Eve in another country. But this exile marker would apply as well to the heterosexual couples such as Cass and Richard, Rufus and Leona, and Vivaldo and Ida. For sexual exile, while it may offer an appropriate lens to which to view Baldwin's homosexual characters and their subversive relationships, it may also describe interracial or adulterous interactions, especially within another country's antagonistically heteronormative universe. While various sexual arrangements float to the surface, dimensions of love is the true subject of contestation that trouble the waters. Baldwin's characters, as they witness the dissolution and creation of old and new love, experience erotic exile and estrangement in their departure from or toward a mate, and not only because their sexuality is considered deviant. Yet these seeming rebels are not true exiles if this term implies that the regions from which they departed are irredeemably hostile. In a nod to Baldwin's description of himself as a, quote, transatlantic commuter, unquote, commuter comports better with the fluid movement of these characters, I would suggest. Whereas exile suggests coercion, commuter brings to mind freedom of movement and self-determination. As sexual others, Baldwin's characters are not forcefully expelled from their native land or from some area of the city. Rather, they make a temporary and expedient departure only to return, often and frequently as they see fit, just as Baldwin did in his relationship with America. Such personal agency underlies in part Baldwin's positioning of concrete images and dramatic metaphors of love or sex as challenges to the status quo. Secondly, the principal agonists in the novel, in their flight from New York proper or decampment from one site in the city to another, find themselves in spaces scholars have designated as utopian or as illusory. In exploring the implications of this term, I find its application to another country interesting, useful, but also problematic, prompting me to take recourse to Michel Foucault's coinage, heterotopia. This usage, at the very least, helps to problematize these alternate spaces, sometimes designated as utopian, temporary retreats, that is, for Baldwin's so-called exiles or commuters. Such spaces, following Foucault, could be described as, in his phrase, heterotopias of deviation. Places, that is, where seeming outcasts practice lifestyle preferences in counteraction to overly technocratic or punitively heteronormative social structures that otherwise surround them. Such seemingly ideal spaces may be conceived of as exilic destinations, and thus alternately labeled utopias. While they may appear as potential oases, these spaces emerge more deeply and comprehensibly when examined as heterotopias. In a broad program of analysis that he dubs heterotopology, Foucault outlines several examples of such quote-unquote heterotopias of deviation. Sites at variance with the common definition of utopia as a non-place. In other words, where perfection exists. The heterotopic approach, alternately, allows readers to conceive such sites as sexual and racial havens. However brief the effect, that remain connected to the real world, unlike the illusions and fantasies classically associated with utopia. A heterotopia, quote, exists in reality, unquote, where, says Foucault, quote, it exerts a sort of counteraction, unquote, to events preceding and following it. In addition, such destinations, while actual and real, offer a, quote, simultaneously mythic contestation, unquote, of conventions, as Foucault instructs. While this mythic aspect, with this mythic aspect, heterotopia offers in a single term the opportunity to examine the linked mythic and the real dimensions of certain images, tropes, and motifs. That is to say, the same heterotopia, as Foucault explains, quote, can, according to the synchrony of the culture in which it occurs, have one function or another, unquote. Heterotopia, in other words, encapsulates binary conditions operative in the real world. Areas that may be cited as utopian include, okay, so I'm sorry, just switching now to another country. Areas that may be cited as utopian include a brief balcony scene in chapter 1, Cass and Richard's living room, Eric and Eve's beach house on the Mediterranean, and even a rooftop visited by Vivaldo, all fueled by alcohol and or marijuana and closely linked with love and lovemaking. These are nevertheless real, not fantastical settings. That said, in a heterotopian analysis, a mythical reading of these same locations is possible. The text's apparent feints at depicting utopian terrains, created apparently as locales perfectly suited for the exercise of divergent sexual amalgamations, led me paradigmatically to that too frequently alluded to pastoral topos, the locus amoenus, a figure that doubles both as an ancient model of and source analogy for utopia. Exhibiting a paradigm more nuanced than that commonly associated with the language of utopia, pastoral's conceit of the somewhat misused locus amoenus is firmly aligned with Foucault's conception of heterotopia. Yet, unlike utopia, the locus amoenus setting is not a restricted, closed locality to which deviants are exiled. Such an ancient fictional locale, populated by sheep, lakes, rivers, mountains, etc., is accompanied by heterosexual, homosexual, and bisexual characters that are not depicted as deviants in forced exile to this special realm. In privileging an essentially literary-based pedigree, steeped in nature imagery, and deeply attended upon concepts of love, amorous and erotic, pastoral, and its locus amoenus problematize utopian associations and are deeply commodious with a fiction such as Baldwin's novel. Surprisingly, perhaps Baldwin's almost hyper-realistic, high modernist narrative rests upon an ancient mythic residue, highlighting an aesthetic dimension that goes beyond the topical issues upon which his narrative is generated. What these supercharged spaces have in common, other than the depiction of issues related to love and sex, are their proximity to water, the Hudson River in particular, in an analogy to pastoral's sylvan setting. While this watery motif is obvious in the case of the Mediterranean Sea, the temporary home of Eric and Eve, it is less obvious in regard to Leona and Rufus's balcony episode or scenes in Cass's living room. Scenes in Cass's living room. It is even less obvious in regards to other sites in the novel, such as Vivaldo's rooftop orgy. Yet repeated interpositions of riverine and water imagery reinforce themes that link the novel not only to a variety of literary pedigrees across time and place, but also to a broad, otherwise non-literary set of philosophical and epistemological propositions. I will focus briefly on two of these spaces, the balcony scene in the first chapter and the living room in the second, in conjunction with the mythopoeic implications of the Hudson River and its proximity to each of these sites. So in the second chapter first, for instance, while Cass and Richard's living room may code at first as utopic by its proximity to the Hudson River, pastoral overtones bring into focus its function as a locus amoenus. With its wide windows, it offers a space, unquote, quote unquote, as Ida, Rufus's sister, puts it, that is pleasingly bucolic in its openness to the natural environment. So this short quote, she comes into the room and she looks around, she says, the narrator says, the living room was down 2 steps and the wide windows opened on a view of the river. Ida seemed checked, but only for an instant, by the view of the river. She walked into the center of the room. This is wonderful. You people have really got some space. She is checked, though, by, and that ends the quote, she is checked, though, by the resonance of the river within which her brother drowned. The illusion of utopia punctured by the river's organic memory, causing the space to take on a dualism that provides Ida with a sad reminder of and some compensation for her drowned brother. Cass's apartment, but particularly the living room and its large windows, links the river's placidity with the perfect bourgeois couple who inhabit the apartment, creating an aura of undisturbed complacency, the picture, in short, of a modern urban utopia. A utopian atmosphere is also established by the pleasantries associated with the several parties staged in the room. But it is not a true utopia. Its complex web of associations call for a stronger term to describe its implications, such as the sylvan iconography of the Hudson River. It confers the status of a safe house of a kind for aspiring artists, such as the budding singer Ida and the spinners of tales, Ivaldo and Richard, that is to say, poets writ large. Like pastoral shepherds, these artists as such find an escape from the terrors of the outside world in this living room. Yet, and while leaving Richard aside in his role as the cliched homosexual for the moment, the others garner less support for their craft of singing and writing, notably, than they do for assistance with adjusting to their deviant sexual desires. The Hudson River, just outside the windows, serves as a silent observer, or I'd also use the word witness, silent observer whose presence imparts a special utopian pleasance upon any scene proximate to its appearance. It also speaks as a consummately liminal entity and borderland, demarking the space, figuratively and literally, between the legitimate and the illegitimate, particularly in regards to varieties of love. If, in response to Foucault's suggestion, heterotopias consist of mythic and real contestations, the river's role in this scenario as a witness to deviant contestations of social norms on the one hand, and on the other, its purpose, I'm sorry, this is not a good sentence here. As a witness to these, to deviant contestations of social norms on the one hand, and the other, its purpose, I think is what I want to say, with easing society's ambivalence towards so-called deviant love. Did that come across? Okay. Water imagery thus silently endorses the love interest among the text's major personalities and relationships, while acting as a dispassionate and normalizing witness to the perhaps temporary dissolution of such relationships. Okay, so before commenting on the balcony scene between Rufus and Leona, I would like to further document the Hudson River's association with Rufus and its pastoral implications. Long before Rufus's suicide leap into the Hudson River, the river motif accompanies Rufus throughout the first chapter, complete with his memory that this same river complex was the body of water into which years earlier he and other children once, quote, dived from occasional rotting promontories, unquote. Although Rufus migrates from the natural innocence of the woody cliffs of his childhood to the technocratic post-Edenic contours of the electrified George Washington Bridge, both experiences take place above and within New York's system of rivers. From this perspective, semiotically speaking, it is more than coincidental that Baldwin selects the word promontory to describe Rufus's youthful frolics on the river, especially when one takes into consideration that promontory, this term of choice is commonly associated with pastoral's famous, and for those, I say famous for classicists, it's famous, some of us remember it, may have forgotten it, but this thing called the Leucadian promontory in pastoral literature, from which Sappho and other pastoral lovers contemplated leaping or leapt. Sorry. This is 5 minutes. Okay. The river's pastoral analogy is reinforced by tropes or emblems linked with Arcadia and related literature. Such water-related archetypes may be drawn specifically from Theocritus's idols, texts broadly devoted to ideas concerned with love and sex, that's to say, with depicting the mutability of actual, not doctrinaire, sexual behavior. For present purposes, Theocritus's idol 1 offers a source. Therein, the lovelorn Daphnis drowns himself perhaps by leaping into a river. We say perhaps because it's a little ambiguous in the actual text, or figuratively speaking, into the Acheron, a river of Hades. Or to take another example, idol number 13, in which Heracles' mate, the youthful shepherd, the Eromenos, or pederast, Hylas, is pulled into a lake by river nymphs out of their mad love for him, thus playing their role as water spirits to which Hylas is forever committed, and a search for whom Heracles commits himself actually and spiritually for his remaining days. Beyond ecological symbolism, the river's teleology connects nature-informed activities from the past with man-made ones in the present, and with nebulous future eventualities. Ultimately transfers the impact of Rufus's death onto other sites associated with love arrangements depicted later in the novel. A lengthier discussion which would offer an opportunity to learn more by comparing his love for Leona with that of Ivaldo for Ida, and Eric against that of Heracles for Hylas, and Daphnis for his goddess. Okay, finally, with the foregoing in mind, it is not easier to appreciate that at the beginning of the first chapter, and as a prelude to Rufus's watery death, Rufus and Leona, his new love, enter on a balcony that codes as Locus Amoenus by its location on Riverside Drive. As the name of the street indicates, the Hudson River runs just before it, foreshadowed as the same watery space within which Rufus's body engulfed and submerged will soon be found. The riverine imagery further corresponds with the sexual motions and emotions of the couple on the balcony. The guiding metaphor of their lovemaking imagines Leona as a virtual watercraft who, in a rocking, rising, and falling motion, quote unquote, carried Rufus on a, quote, slow ride home, unquote, within the locus, as it were, of Leona's body and the pleasaunce of the balcony, above and in full view of the Hudson River. On one face of this liquid emblem, Rufus and Leona's lovemaking reinforces the pastoral meta-narrative of sailing, an image Foucault cites as an iconic exemplar of heterotopia. I'm quoting Foucault, "The ship is the heterotopia par excellence," says Foucault, phenomenologically speaking, adding that, quote, "in civilizations without boats, dreams dry up, espionage takes the place of adventure, and the police take the place of pirates," unquote. Here, existential joy offers the couple respite and compensation before things go downhill, a direction generated by the perceived slights of pedestrians on the streets of New York and the lurking appearance of police throughout another country, but particularly in the first chapter. This is coupled as well with actual slights of which Rufus is aware, associated with the American South, as related in the tales told first by Leona for her abusive white husband, and second by Rufus of his southern beating by the husband's southern white counterparts. It is a heterotopia as much of space. Okay, thus, based on the power and seeming violence of this first sex act, its utopic dimensions mostly go unnoticed. Informed by heterotopic principles, Rufus's claim that he would make Leona cry denote the idiosyncrasies of sexual performance, where such situations often mix the tender with the violent, producing the typical moans and cries of lovemaking. Most of the violence in Rufus's performance is at worst ambiguous and lodged within his inner thoughts, but more likely a reference not to Leona, but to those he assumes might object to and or attempt to interrupt or prevent his pleasure with a white woman. The symbolism of his watery ride underscores his psychological flight from the repressive and disconnected forces with which he otherwise contends, prompting him to believe that nothing could stop him, quote, not the white god, unquote, nor, quote, a lynch mob arriving on wings, unquote, would have the power to stop his cathartic objective. Leona, in response to their sexual adventure, acknowledges, quote, it was so wonderful, unquote, indicating that she cried for joy and pleasure and not in response to a brutality, a violence more in Rufus's thoughts than in anything he does physically, and which is not actually directed towards her. Despite many scholarly suggestions to the contrary, and despite what takes place later in the chapter, I insist that in this early episode, Rufus is not attempting to harm Leona, and he does not do so. Rather than view the scene's violent language as dystopian, it should be understood rather as language that reaches heterotopic dimensions in offering, to a considerable extent, a place where the lovers may indulge their utopic desires free from the damning eyes of normative society, while still touched by the tragedy and disappointment of, in this case, racist taboos. My final paragraph. The Hudson River flowing below appears actually or figuratively as a leitmotif tracking the novel's various love affairs. As a New York City landmark, the Hudson River maps out the moral terrain of the first chapter and unites its various episodes of that chapter in a tour de force of narrative brilliance. As a mythopoeic signature, the Hudson River offers a basis from which an analogy to millennial-long love motifs associated with pastoral literature may be launched as a possible aesthetic approach to reading another country. Thank you. And now we have Professor English. I didn't want to run the risk. So you sit up, Sam.
I'll stay up. I talk better myself. Thanks for being here on the last panel. You could
Yes.
be drinking wine.
We will.
You brought it.
We will soon.
Did you bring it with?
No.
So I want to sort of, before I actually start the talk about the ways that I was sort of thrilled that the first plenary session, and then the session that Jackie Goldsby was in earlier today really sort of they both dovetail with some of my ideas in ways I didn't necessarily expect, particularly around religion and queerness. And it's sort of been, I think, a thread through the entire conference, returning to the supposed tension between religion and queerness, Christianity and queerness. I'm not saying supposed tension, but revisiting this issue. So my sort of goal in this paper is to weave together Christianity, queerness, and time, and mathematics. Which, yeah, I'm going to try. More precise, geometry and genre. So the social science fiction of my title, I think I invented that. I mean, I don't know anybody else who's used that term. So that's my goal. Focusing on Go Tell the Monoton in Another Country. So the talk, while it is quite clearly print talk, emerges from this digital project that I'm doing right now. It's a purely digital project on Afrofuturism and a sabbatical revelation. And it's really good to have those, both sabbaticals and revelations. That the afterlife, whether it's religious or secular, is in fact a future. I never thought of it that way. And so those of us who study 19th century African American literature might understand a Christian belief in the afterlife is primarily even a means to derail this life resistance. I'm going to quote briefly from Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. So this is Linda Brent's description of her Uncle Benjamin and his defiance of the very religious grandmother. So this is Linda saying, "She asked if he did not also think of God. I fancied I saw his face grow fierce in the moonlight. He answered, 'No, I did not think of him. When a man is hunted like a wild beast, he forgets there is a God, a heaven. He forgets everything in his struggle to get beyond the reach of the bloodhounds.'" But at least in my argument, the afterlife also permits us to think differently, and I think perhaps in liberatory terms about time. And it even may permit us to understand the unexpected compatibility, at least in James Baldwin's hands, of Christianity and queerness. And I know that using the term queer in relationship to James Baldwin does not respect his own resistance. I'm going to do it anyway.
It's been done throughout the conference, so you go right ahead.
The complexities of time, in particular, that religion and queer theory share, provide a clue, I think, to explain the compatibility. An afterlife is a future, yeah. But it's also coeval, and there I'm using Johannes Fabian's anthropological term to mean at the same happening at the same time. So the afterlife has always been there, temporally proximate. Yet those for us who are still alive, it's always in the future. So this sort of complex and I think non-teleological understanding of time is very much in keeping, I think, with Baldwin's representations of religion and homoeroticism, of Christianity and queerness. I think these are only seemingly contradictory terms. And I'm not uniquely making this argument. Margot Natalie Crawford has already observed the intertwining of same-sex desire and religion in Baldwin's fiction, arguing that he locates, this is a quote, a homoerotic spirituality that emerges as a liberation of theology. And Michael L. Cobb has argued similarly that a character like John Grimes in Go Tell It on the Mountain, quote, inflects queerly the normal religious rhetoric of Baldwin's world. But, this is what I think, Baldwin in his fiction doesn't merely inflect or revise or work within conventional religious, rhetorical, temporal, literary, or social structures in order to accommodate queerness. Rather, he elevates and centers queerness while revealing the pathology of conventional sexualities and conventional times. Now, in doing so, I think that he presents a queer futurity that is a futurity, but it's also not isolated from either past or present. He thus anticipates, and this is a thesis alert, anticipates and exceeds contemporary queer temporal theory of Lee Edelman and Jose Munoz. I think particularly in Go Tell It on the Mountain in Another Country, heterosexuality looks really bad. Pretty unrelentingly bad. And here I want to, this is a sidebar, to put in a plug for a book that I think has been neglected. Mason Stokes' The Color of Sex, which I think was the early 90s. But he reminds us that the history of the term heterosexuality in the early 20th century was coined as a diagnostic term to describe excessive opposite sex sexual desire and behavior. I sort of want to pull that back in, the sense of heterosexuality as pathology, for this talk. And to just give, these are just two examples. Go Tell It on the Mountain, John overhears his parents having sex while rats scream. And in Another Country, the only sustained heterosexual relationship, that between Cass and Richard, is pure misery. And that misery is only compounded by the presence of their children. So I'm thinking that Baldwin is advancing a hypothesis. This is where the math is coming in the social science fiction, that heterosexual relationships, whether inter or interracial, cannot thrive. It is they, not queer relationships, that have no future, to adapt Edelman's phrase. So while Baldwin's positive representations of queerness, or maybe even ambivalent, but positive, have received a great deal of attention in the last 15 years, 20 years. And I'm thinking here particularly of Rob Ferguson's analysis, in part because of Mari Weeks brought it up earlier today, and challenged the sort of positive reading of the end of Go Tell It on the Mountain. So that's interesting. But a lot less attention has been paid to what I take to be complementary representations of hetero, and this is where there's an interesting, tension between the first two papers. A heterosexual dystopia,
Yeah.
To the ways that a dismal, devitalized, and static heterosexuality is supplanted by same-sex desire or queerness, marked by dynamism and by non-standard temporalities, as well as by non-teleological narrative form. And this is where I'm bringing in the fiction part. One that doesn't end in either straight marriage or children. Now, this is evidenced by Baldwin's suggested, but certainly not definitive, endings in Go Tell It on the Mountain in Another Country. So we all know, I don't have to explain Go Tell It on the Mountain, this loosely autobiographical novel, where John Grimes, who's a kind of Baldwin stand-in, ends with a holy kiss between John and Elisha, the young preacher he desires, even as John then turns away towards his family, though he hasn't gotten there yet at the novel's end. I'm coming, he says. I'm on my way. And Another Country ends with male lovers, Eric and Eve, reuniting in New York with, quote, Eric smiling down at him and Eve is arriving by plane. And Eve's certainty that everything would be all right And he and Eric are to come together in, quote, the city in which people from heaven had made their home. Now, this heaven is a very different sort of afterlife than the one John Grimes was contemplating in Go Tell It on the Mountain. And here's another, we're about to have another connection between the talks. In Go Tell It on the Mountain's movie theater scene, John Grimes feels he must choose between staying at the movies, where this alternative world of pleasure unfolds before him, and returning to the church, which offers him redemption and, quote, life everlasting. That is a Christian afterlife. He's either damned or saved. So another country begins in the movie theater, with Rufus, the black queer jazz musician who's a novel's central concern, despite his early death in the novel, seated in the top row of the balcony. The Shane Vogel, and this is just, this wonderful article. When I reread it, I remember how thrilling it is to reread this article. Has argued wonderfully for closing time in bars and clubs as a temporal space wherein queer experiences forge queer history, a non-written archive of possibility, connection, action. I think both Baldwin's novels depend upon both liminal times and liminal spaces, balconies, movie theater, and to pull into woods very quickly. He talks about cinema's time image, producing a film viewing experience wherein people and things occupy a place and time which is incommensurable with the one they have in space. And I think both novels are interestingly themselves positioned liminally, at least according to conventional periodization, between the Harlem Renaissance and the Black arts and civil rights movements before Stonewall. Moving back to the spaces and times, I think the novels have these alternative space-times, in which Baldwin argues for alternative queer temporalities and possibilities, even the possibility of utopia, with Eve's heaven invoking Munoz's notion of queer utopia 50 years earlier than the book Cruising Utopia. In Munoz's words, the future is queerness's domain, and he's in conversation with and challenging Lee Edelman's No Future. Queerness is a structuring and educated mode of desiring that allows us to see and feel beyond the quagmire of the presence. Queerness is essentially about the rejection of a here and now. This is Munoz. And an insistence on the potentiality or concrete possibility for another world. But Baldwin, and this is back to the thesis, I don't think he posits a queerness that rejects the here and now. I think his fiction engages at once with the past, with the present, and with prophecy in such a way that he establishes a non-linear and non-teleological temporality. And here I'm going to pull in the Agamben, and I will tell you, I just told something earlier, I think this is telling people earlier that I have a stubborn resistance to the theorist du jour, and I know Agamben's genre is a bit past, but I felt like there was this moment when I had to use him precisely because it's sort of political and theological blending in Agamben. So I'm going to pull him in briefly, and then I'm going to tear him down through somebody else, actually. So I'm going to use Agamben here very briefly, despite the limitations, to help us start thinking through Baldwin's, I think, complex representations of time. So for Baldwin as for Agamben, and this is an Agamben quotation, the whole past, the whole of history is summarily contained in the present. So I think Baldwin's quite aware of the weight of history, particularly of racial and racist history in the US, and the ways that history shapes, stunts human relationships, particularly heterosexual ones, or ones that depend on conventional notions of masculinity and femininity. So I think that's true even in Giovanni's room. Let's see.
Another 10 minutes.
10 minutes, that's good. That's all I need. It's a novel that, despite its tragic ending, also has that space in Giovanni's room of possibility and an alternative temporality. And the grimness, and there is grimness associated with queer relationships in the novel, can't be disentangled, at least in my view, from their adherence to conventional gender roles. The novel shows decadence and cruelty, even violence, in all relationships that conform to conventional ideals of masculinity and femininity, regardless of the sex of those new relationships. So this, I'm adding this all up to argue that Baldwin's forwarding a queer theory of alt-la-lettre, it's the only French I used, through a kind of social scientific fiction. And he begins with a hypothesis of dysfunction produced by those traditional roles and by heterosexuality. And it turns out that this experiment, it's kind of an experiment, social scientific fiction, requires mathematics. And I think he presents data in the form of triangulated relationships, a geometry shaped by race, gender, and sexuality. We should think here especially of another country where the characters, including Rufus Vivaldo, Rufus's sister Ida, Leona, Jane, Cass, Eric, and Eve, consistently interact in shifting ways that keeps three of them in play. Through the makeup, but the makeup of the threesomes changes throughout the novel. And sometimes this triangulation happens in sort of classic Sedgwickian way. There's an example. Their narrator remarks, with Leona between them, Rufus and Vivaldo cross the road. Or when Jane is poised between Rufus and Vivaldo, the narrator says she's keeping them equal. But I think that's just one aspect of Baldwin's sort of triangulation experiment. I think it's perhaps the most powerful experiment in social geometry. In another country is formed by the triangle of Rufus, Vivaldo, and Leona. And it's later revised to include Ida, Vivaldo, and Ida's other white male lover. And in my view, it's sort of an allegorical matrix, and I'm pulling in my very distant math background now to talk about matrices. And I won't dwell there, but it's a mathematical term of race and gender and sexuality. It repeatedly demonstrates the failure of heterosexual and interracial relationships to overcome the weight of personal and national histories. They are, after all, in the narrator's words, bowed down with memory. And Leona, for example, is the unwitting heiress of generations of bitterness. To over against this non-future of heterosexuality doomed by its historical inheritances, I think Baldwin concludes his novels with queer futurity. But his queer future, unlike Munoz's, acknowledges the ongoing power and presence of the past and embraces the here and now. So both go tell it on a mountain in another country, and I'm going to do some hyper-close reading, but really brief hyper-close reading, and with present participles, and therefore with present and future. John's "I'm coming," Eric's "smiling." Now, in August 1970, and I know that Mika knows this book I'm about to talk about, an extraordinary series of conversations took place between Margaret Mead and James Baldwin. They met for 7.5 hours of talk, and it took place over 2 days and was transcribed in this 1971 book, Wrath on Race. The last section of the book turns on Baldwin's opening gambit. He's replying to Margaret Mead's question, "What's been bugging you all day?" And this is Baldwin's reply. Enormous question. For me, an enormous question. I still don't know quite how to put it, but it has something to do with time present. This time and time. And he goes on to say, that's the only time there is, meaning now. There isn't any other time. But this wasn't to argue, I don't think, that history has no power. I think rather for Baldwin as for Agamben, again, the whole past, the whole history is to say summarily contained in the present. But just as he does Edelman and Munoz one better, I think Baldwin also exceeds Agamben. Now, Alex Wahelier, if you want to see a thoroughgoing, challenging dismantling of Agamben, I think Alex Wahelier is your person. He's critiqued Agamben for starting off in a good way of positing the ways in which spectacular and otherwise oppressive democracies can also produce singularities, those subversive movements and events that form a messianic interruption of state representation. But then, Wahelier says he doesn't acknowledge that subversion can happen via the rigorous and imaginative thinking of the politics that rests in the tradition of the oppressed. In other words, it is in a writer like Baldwin, with his version of a queer utopia, that we can find an interruption in what Edelman would term procreative prejudice, that is, state-interested promotion of conventional forms of human sexuality and relationships. And ultimately, I think the thinker that I've come across, who I feel is most compatible with Baldwin in this context, is Hortense Spillers. His interruption of social, sexual, and narrative representations, in part because she invites religion back into this experiment, the social scientific fiction. In her classic essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, Spillers argues that the Black female is positioned monstrously, in a good way, outside of the traditional symbolics of female gender. And I think let yourself imagine Black queerness in the place of female gender here. And it is our task to make a place for this different social subject, actually claiming the monstrosity the Black female subject might rewrite, after all, a radically different text for female empowerment. Then in another essay, which I don't think, it's another text I think hasn't gotten enough attention. It's an essay on African American sermons called "Moving on Down the Line." The title, which has a participle in it. She writes, this is Spillers, "It seems to me that it is the role of the sermon to replay not only the narrative of the indomitable, irremediable otherness of death, but its outcome on the other side of disaster, the good time coming." Baldwin, through his sermonic fiction, his prophecy and his history, and his having something to do with time present, is making a place, indeed a new world, centered on Black and queer subjects, a world that produces radically different texts for human empowerment, and that is the good time coming.
Great, no, this is great. So we now have Ms. Victoria Merriweather.
Bonjour. That's the limit of my French. Okay, the subject that I'll be speaking on is seeking asylum in Giovanni's room. Baldwin once said, "To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be enraged almost all of the time." I didn't realize just how angry I was until I read Giovanni's room. How is it that a book centered around a white American delivered this revelation to me? I used to wonder, why did Baldwin take the race factor out of this text? He, after all, was both gay and Black, but it became clear to me that he was revealing a much larger issue, one that affects all types of marginalized people living in America. Though many people flock to America in the pursuit of happiness, there are many more who are excluded from the American dream and have to seek asylum. It wasn't just my skin color that excluded me from living the American dream, but my refusal to assimilate. Here, Baldwin tussles with the question, how does one use love as a tool to untangle himself from society's tightly woven nets? I plan to explore that in this presentation. Having left America at the tender age of 24, Baldwin was given a sense of clarity that his fellow activists did not have. His decision to leave was the beginning of his emancipation, and it was this freedom that allowed him to channel his rage into his writing. Through both his essays and novels, he explored this idea that it is love that transcends the boundaries that separate continents and social norms alike. Though Baldwin spent most of his time abroad, he was a consistent voice for marginalized people, particularly people of color and the LGBT community. Baldwin was not alone. Many Black Americans have fled the country to seek asylum from the persecution doled out over generations through slavery and Jim Crow laws. However, Baldwin continued to eloquently tackle these issues head-on through his many essays, novels, and speaking engagements. He illustrates the key to one's deliverance is love in one of his earliest novels, Giovanni's Room. In Giovanni's Room, Baldwin explores the life of David, a closeted homosexual who tries to escape the restraints of American society by fleeing to France. Through David, Baldwin provides a clear view of the alienating impact of internalized oppression on a person who denies his true identity because of his assumed negative image. The nomadic David attempts to physically and mentally escape his own demons, but his self-exile only makes his inability to love more apparent. In France, he surrounds himself with people like him, yet renders himself an outcast among people who will accept who he really is. Unlike his estranged father, whose assumed disapproval ultimately forces his exit to France. The father-son relationship illustrated here also serves as a proxy for the relationship between African Americans and the often abusive America. Here, Baldwin reveals how distance lifts the fog of negative socialization of American society and liberates those who have otherwise been cast out. David is so damaged by his father emotionally that he ultimately disconnects himself from everyone attempting to love him. David is at a young age deprived of the love and nurturing that is necessary for him to experience these same emotions, as well as connect to others. Much like the strained relationship between white and black Americans, David finds it difficult to be vulnerable and trust his heart to another person due to past violations of this trust. So you see, Baldwin had to leave. Baldwin had to leave the US in order to be his authentic self. It is not until he left his cell of socialization that Baldwin, along with many other African Americans, had the chance to just be. Much like Maya Angelou's journey to Ghana, or Nina Simone's trek to Liberia, or even Malcolm X's pilgrimage to Mecca, Baldwin needed to leave America to restore his artistic and activist mind. Consider this: Go Tell on a Mountain, a book that very intimately describes Baldwin's childhood, was not finished until he left America. Baldwin could be whoever he wanted to be, and his publication of the then controversial Giovanni's Room is a reflection of that. Baldwin could cast one of the stones off of his shoulder, being a black gay man in America. Here, Baldwin was able to explore parts of himself that he had been previously been socialized to ignore. Because he was in a place where he could be free to engage in that exploration without being hinged under the sexually repressed American rule. David represents so many Americans living on the edge of society who aren't given the freedom to be their authentic selves, who were taught at a very young age that they are deviants of society. Meanwhile, Giovanni's presence constantly urges David to divorce himself from the negative socialization he has clung to all of his life. Much like the threshing floor experience for John in Go Tell It on the Mountain, David's conversion is arduous as he has to face his father's psychological subjugation and cast off so many layers. How many Black Americans are still struggling to divorce themselves from the negative ideology that we are other and therefore undeserving of love and basic equality? Some of us find that we still need to flee, to find clarity, to leave our adopted homelands and return to love. Plagued by his own inability to love himself, David's concept of love becomes so distorted that he does not know how to love anyone else. His lack of self-love causes him to doubt the value of his homosexual love. His obsession with what other people think of him causes him to engage in self-denial. This is the same lack of self-embrace you see in many African Americans living under the American gaze. It is actually David's relocation to France that makes his attraction to men more apparent. Not only do the French easily recognize him as an American, but also as a homosexual man because he's doing a bad job of hiding it. The mere fact that Baldwin has David leave his native country says much about America. Baldwin once said, quote, "Something very sinister happens to people of a country when they begin to distrust their own reactions as deeply as they do here and become as joyless as they have become," end quote. This effect American society has on David influences him so much he cannot escape it, even when he is worlds away. In America, David is able to hide his inability to love because he is living on the fringes of society. No one cares. In France, it is obvious that he not only struggles with his sexuality, but his ability to even deem himself worthy of love. Giovanni, who sees right through David's lies, declares, quote, "You want to leave Giovanni because he makes you stink. You despise Giovanni because he is not afraid to stink of love. You want to kill him in the name of all your lying moralities. And you are immoral. You are by far the most immoral man I've ever met in my life. Is this what you should do to love?" Giovanni is depicted as fragile because of his openness in loving David. But in some ways, he is stronger than David because he refuses to resign himself to be prey for society to devour. David's manipulation of his fiancée and Giovanni evidences society's manipulation of him, while Baldwin's critique of how society has poisoned the minds of many is embodied in David's character. Even Jacques, a mutual friend of David and Giovanni, remarks, "Love him and let him love you. If you think of them as dirty, then they will become dirty. They will be dirty because you will be giving nothing, and you will be despising your flesh and his." Giovanni's reminder of what Jacques stated earlier causes David to retreat from him rather than surrender to his true desires, because his desires come second to society's view. Thomason once noted that, quote, "The sexual and racial questions have always been intertwined. If Americans can mature on the level of racism, then they can mature on the level of sexuality. Americans are terrified of feeling anything, and homophobia is simply an extreme example of the American terror of growing up," end quote. Baldwin is making the same statement in Giovanni's room. Hence, he chooses to make David a white American. He does not make racial issues the focus of this novel, but rather centers on the larger issue of love and self-acceptance. Baldwin contrasts David's character with that of Giovanni to show how love can help one remain unaffected by social taboos. Giovanni accepts his lifestyle because he loves himself enough to be honest with himself. Although he may be too open with his feelings for David, Giovanni's honesty is a true example of both his character and wisdom. Giovanni's weakness is actually his strength here. Giovanni loves and loves freely because of his desire for David not to be accepted by society. David flees America to seek asylum, but instead of Giovanni's room becoming his sanctuary, it serves as an ugly reminder of the assumed hatred he would be met with back home for his rebellion. David is forced to face the truth about himself and his feelings about Giovanni in Giovanni's small boarding room. This room represents much more than the den that David and Giovanni are allowed to freely express their love. Giovanni's room also reflects David's internal conflict. He describes the room as follows. The table was loaded with yellowing newspapers and empty bottles. But it was not the room's disorder which was frightening. It was the fact that when one began searching for the key in this disorder, one realized that it was not to be found in any of the usual places. Quite the metaphor for David's attempt at finding love. Like the ever-present dirt and dust that offends John Grimes, the chaos David finds in the room bothers him, but he makes no attempt to clean it up because the room represents his and Giovanni's relationship. David does not want to stop loving Giovanni, but society's view of homosexuality forces him to view it in the same way that he views the cramped and disorderly room. Andrew Shin notes that, quote, Giovanni's room is both a haven from and a symbol of society's oppressive strictures, end quote. David describes it as a trap, one in which he has no choice but to face his demons. Everything in that room serves as a reminder of everything that has occurred in that room between him and Giovanni. As David states, life in that room seemed to be occurring underwater, as I say, and it is certain that I underwent a sea change there. In the confines of that room, a symbol of David's dilemma, David discovers the truth about himself. Although David needs desperately to fill the void in his heart, he admonishes himself for experiencing happiness in his relationship with Giovanni because it is not accepted. David would rather deny himself true love in order to gain acceptance from society. If he had a stronger sense of self-embrace, he might find the strength to resist social definition and live on his own terms. But although his external composure reflects a man who is full of confidence and happiness, he is actually a deeply divided and unhappy person. David's crossroad comes when he has to decide whether he is going to acknowledge his love for Giovanni or whether he will willingly chain himself to society's definition of him and stay with his fiancée. Unfortunately, David chooses to die a slow death by not only staying with his fiancée, whom he does not love, but also denying his love for Giovanni. Baldwin illustrates through David that even people who are loved by others can be tormented by their inability to love themselves. Here as elsewhere, Baldwin contrasts those who are full of love with those who have none. In this case, Giovanni and David. While David carries shame and deceit, Giovanni exhibits sincerity and devotion. Because David does not allow himself to be loved and thus liberates himself from self-doubt, he loses not only his fiancée, but his true love, Giovanni. Just as John had to release himself from his father's hypocritical grasp, David needs to free himself from the chains of a typical societal view. David chooses society instead of himself and has to live without love until he dies. As Baldwin once stated, love takes off the mask that we feel we cannot live without, and no, we cannot live within. David's refusal to take off this mask turned what could have been a beautiful love story into a tragedy. Merci.
Thank you.
Okay, and finally,
Wow.
Ginger Schillings.
Final speaker, final panel, final day. I salute your stamina. And I'm just going to keep it very short because I knew, of course, that this was the position that you all would be tired. So I'm just going to make a really tiny little point that interests me. James Baldwin's novel Giovanni's Room of 1952 tends to leave one, or me at least, with two main reading impressions. First, the impression that the love between the protagonists, David and Giovanni, is a great and irreplaceable love. And second, that David's betrayal of Giovanni is enormous and irredeemable. They have a brief but intense relationship as two foreigners in Paris, but David abandons Giovanni. He helps expose him to poverty and despair and passively watches him sink into absolute degradation, a state that is formulated in the gender terms of a feminization associated with complete obliteration as an individual in the novel. When Giovanni tries to break free from this, he kills and is sentenced to death. David tells the story of their love at the precise moment of Giovanni's execution. The night of Giovanni's death is the moment when David realizes the full extent of both his love and his guilt. The question arises then why the novel ends with David just walking away, and why Baldwin is even able to strike a somewhat hopeful tone in the concluding scene. I want to suggest that this hopeful ending is made possible and meaningful by a very interesting use of the then contemporary trope of the white American traveler to Europe. The trope of the American traveler to Europe is comparatively widespread in the 1950s. It features typically a white American who flees the anxieties and emptiness of his American life and seeks to reconnect to a foreign home continent. Once in Europe, and we've heard this many times during this conference, the traveler discovers that Europeans are in fact unsurpassably different and that he cannot be at home here. The American traveler typically does not discover Europe in Europe, but his own Americanness, and returns to the United States with a matured affirmation of American cultural values. In the 1950s, this codified epiphany of the white American traveler, namely that he is indeed American, tends to be very directly and explicitly interwoven with a negotiation of the notion of human dignity. Giovanni's Room is not an exception to this. However, this novel varies the construction in interesting and important ways, and this is what I want to talk about today. In the 1950s, there are two traditions of understanding the term human dignity in the United States that we need to be aware of. The first tradition goes back to the invention of the American way of life in the 1930s, and in this discourse, the United States constitutes the exemplary case of a nation and a corresponding value system characterized by a profound and unique and of course exceptional respect for the inherent worth of every human being. The United States were explicitly believed in this discourse to constitute a model of nationhood that celebrated the political and legal and obviously cultural recognition of human dignity, and the American civilizing mission was essentially understood to encourage others abroad to value dignity as well. Additionally, in the 1950s, we have to consider the then recent institutional establishment of the human rights regime, which defines human dignity negatively as the right of each human being not to be denied his or her humanity, whatever that means. It's not really explicitly defined for reasons. The kind of violence, brutality, force, degradation that is forbidden here is always conceptualized as the sort of violence that serves to obliterate the individual character of a human being, that serves to reduce him or her to an object. And that is a violation of human dignity. Now, usually, literary texts on the American traveler from the 1950s that have both of these discourses available, they tend to use the trope of the American traveler to develop a harmonious conflation of these two understandings of dignity, which makes sense because they can easily be constructed as complementary. The human rights regime helps understand what constitutes a violation of dignity, and the American way of life helps explain what constitutes a way to prevent such violation. And Giovanni's Room does it differently. This novel agrees that the violation of a person's dignity translates as the obliteration of individual character and the destruction of human life on that very basis. And it agrees also that this violation of dignity is the ultimate violation of any human being. But the novel does not agree that the American way of life provides a good answer to the demands formulated by the human rights regime's negative formulation of dignity. Instead, David's very Americanness is identified as the root cause for his irredeemable violation of Giovanni's dignity. So, if American values are rejected as being protective of dignity, what kind of answer does the novel develop in response to the demand that dignity must not be violated but protected? It's not surprising, obviously, to this audience that the answer is love. I just want to make two observations that help me clarify where specifically I see the link between love and dignity in Giovanni's Room. First, David's abandonment of Giovanni can be structurally related to Giovanni's own abandonment of his nuclear family before the onset of the novel. Giovanni's love for his deceased son, whose death is also the reason why he leaves, and his own sense of guilt are as total and as existential as David's love and guilt in the narrative present as Giovanni is executed. Nevertheless, Giovanni did experience love again after he had abandoned his family. And so we may assume that David can also experience love again after having abandoned Giovanni. It's just not the same kind of love. The novel develops an understanding of love that allows for different relationships to be equal in depth and value, though not in kind. Love for family is chronologically replaced by romantic love, and romantic love is replaced by something else again. And this something else, I suggest, is a love for humankind that is discernible, especially in the construction of the narrative perspective as a perspective of David, who stands at the threshold of transition from one love to another. We can derive the way he will love from the way in which he already narrates at this point. The second observation then pertains to the difference that retrospection makes in the novel. When you review the plot, one of the most striking similarities that connect all characters is that even and especially their most spontaneous reactions, like a smile, a glance, discomfort, a rush of passion, these reactions tend to be very detached in a way from the situation itself. All characters' most spontaneous reactions respond to a lifetime of values, experiences, and traumas, much more than they respond to the character or the actual situation. The characters of Giovanni's Room are inclined to treat each other as yet another disappointing lover, yet another humiliating encounter, yet another entertaining scandal, and so on and so forth. And these characters tend not to allow others to be much more than cases in point, whatever that emotional point is for each of them. In David, for example, the point is the threatening precariousness of his rigid and heterosexist American manhood, And that problem informs practically all of his encounters, whoever specifically stands in front of him. But when he reviews everything that happens in retrospect as the narrative voice of the novel, David keeps coming back to his own reactions and critically contextualizes them at every turn. In retrospect, David continuously goes beyond the issues that have informed his perspective and his behavior in the plot and tries to carve out what kind of situation this actually was and how he and another character may have actually related in a situation. The narrative voice is especially much more aware and accepting of the feelings and particularly the pain of other characters, even and especially when David had previously acted in complete disregard of precisely that pain. The inherent value, even of the most ridiculous and contemptible characters, is carved out by the consistent difference that is made between David's objectifying actions in the plot and the re-evaluation of these actions and their meaning by the narrative voice. And the possibility of this re-evaluation is rooted in love, because the moments when David and Giovanni are happy with one another are precisely the moments when they just don't care what kind of symbol of the past they might constitute for each other. These are the moments when they exclusively pay attention to each other and to the situation they're in, and just wait to see where the encounter will lead, instead of scripting the outcome in advance, yet another. So this is when they love. The narrative voice adopts this in the course of David's contemplations. And this change in attitude even translates into a different quality of encounter in the novel. When David, in the narrative present, has concluded his story and says goodbye to his landlady, at that point, he can thank her for her somewhat indiscreet comments on his love life, because he is now able to see that she is more than yet another reminder in his inadequacy. He can see through to the fact that she means well and feels pain herself. Now, this is a different quality of encounter. We don't see that elsewhere except with Giovanni. So family love leads over to romantic love, and romantic love leads over to a general perspective of love, epitomized by the narrative voice of the novel. So, in conclusion, I suggest that the novel introduces this kind of perspective rooted in love as a model for the recognition and protection of human dignity, in order to make the case for love as the dignified way of life. Baldwin draws on the definition of human dignity by violation as it is developed in the context of the human rights regime. The absence or abandonment of love is identified as the root cause for violations of dignity and life. And in contrast, the presence of love actually allows the active recognition of dignity in every person. And that sounds banal when you hear it like that, but when you take it literally, as the novel does, this is absolutely radical. It actually requires you to be suspicious of all prevailing conventions of thought that inform even your most naturalized cultural gut reactions. In order not to be cruel towards the human being in front of you, you have to be radically present in the present. And that essentially is love in Giovanni's room. And this radical perspective rewrites, or helps rewrite, the trope of the American traveler as well. David, as a white American traveler to Europe, does not return from Europe to the United States having developed a purified understanding of his culturally unique American virtue. Instead, he returns from his isolated exile in the middle of nowhere to the world at large, and with a radicalized understanding of the loveworthiness of every human being. The trope of the American traveler in Giovanni's room thus helps establish the categorical loveworthiness of all as an independent interpretation of what human dignity means in practice. In doing so, the novel suggests also that the loveworthiness of all is already the right, because it draws on these definitions of the human rights regime, which is the only external reference that is traditionally available. So if human dignity, if love is already, to claim love is already a legitimate claim, and to love in this way, then to love in this way can become an absolute duty, not least of any law-abiding citizen of the United States. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So we will take some questions.
While clearly Baldwin brought us all together, I think these were, we were concentrating primarily on another country in Giovanni's room. And so I hope that the next such conference concentrates on the last two novels a little bit more. But anyway, so I don't think there's any one thing that I can use to draw everything together necessarily. So any questions? Left, right, left?
Okay, thank you. Thanks for all those talks. I've got questions for everyone, but I just wanted to start with Darlene. Thanks, that was fantastic, and it kind of linked up in interesting ways to the discussions we were having about another country and its centering of queerness in the